So now we'll have the first of our two speakers. We're joined by Victoria Hayford, who is an award-winning filmmaker, currently in the process of decolonizing her own mind, as well as attempting to learn how the system of racism, white supremacy works. And to do this in order to come up with strategies to dismantle that system. So Victoria, if you're ready, welcome. Please share with us your talk, which is a question: white privilege or white supremacy?
Good evening, everyone. And thank you very much, Maureen, for inviting me to talk. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And I must say, I'm very impressed how quickly you got this together, Maureen, because I remember just following a Facebook posting you put up literally just 2 or 3 weeks ago. And somehow, you know, mere weeks later has culminated in this event currently attended by over 200 people. So power to you. I want to try and contextualize what I'm going to talk about this evening. We didn't just pluck this subject out of the air. And again, going back to Maureen's Facebook posting, I can't remember exactly how it went, so I'm going to be sort of paraphrasing here. But in a nutshell, Maureen posted something that talked about white privilege. And I had my little 2 pence worth, you know, saying what I thought about it. But then really I thought, let's be honest about how you feel. I've never really understood that term, white privilege, even though I've used it myself. And it's not a great idea using something that you don't readily grasp the meaning of, or something that you don't have a definition for. And I also thought, well, is it really white privilege white people / Europeans are talking about when they're discussing race? I actually said in my posting, I wish we could do away with that term and replace it with what it really is, in my opinion. And I was asked by another friend of Maureen saying, what do you think we can replace this with? Because I agree too. I don't feel that this white privilege is the correct term for the position that white people occupy in society and in white people's relationship with non-whites. And by non-whites, I mean Black people, Asian people, Chinese people, non-Caucasian people. So in thinking about it, I thought our relationship with whites, there's always a power imbalance because of racism, white supremacy. Now, saying this out loud, white supremacy, I wonder if some people are perhaps confused or thinking, you know, white supremacists are these skinheads, you know, with their swastika tattoos, sort of thing. But I actually think white supremacy is the system which governs the world globally, is inescapable. And I think we need to be honest about what we think that system is. And in fact, that's what I said on the Facebook posting, that I think if we're ever going to tackle this issue of racism, both white and Black alike need to be honest, at least as honest as we can bear, because I find when it comes to racism, white people are not entirely honest, and Black people and non-whites fear speaking up because of the punishment that could be meted out to us by the system, because we are dominated by the system. So I'm going to be very honest tonight with my thoughts on what I think we're actually trying to deal with. I don't think white people have privilege. And I think when white people say they have privilege, they actually mean that they have power and are not being entirely honest about it, because I think it's possibly one of the ways that racism is practiced, by not using accurate words, terms, and language to describe the situation. So I'm going to have a crack at trying to define what I think the system is. And I call it racism, white supremacy, because I think they're the same thing. Racism, for me, this is the definition I tend to keep in the back of my mind, and it keeps me focused in order to understand what the system is. So this is the definition. For racism, white supremacy, I use racism and white supremacy interchangeably. Here's the definition: a global system of people who have classified themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classified as not white. Now, this crystallizes my thinking, because racism, white supremacy really is a hierarchical system, a hierarchical racial system in which there are power differentials. White people created the system in order to dominate those they've classified as non-white. And so it's not privilege, but it's power, because privilege is something that you work for, in my opinion. And to use as an energy, I consider myself, because I'm mortgage free. After 25 years of slogging and working hard, and with the threat of losing the house and everything, I've managed to pay off the mortgage with interest. And I'm now mortgage free, and I consider myself privileged. But I earned that. I worked for that for a long time. White privilege is not accurate, because white people did not work for their position in society and under the system of racism, white supremacy. White people went about the world colonizing, enslaving, subjugating, pillaging, committing genocide, theft, in order to bring about this position of power. That's not working. That's terrorizing non-white people of the world. So I say we do away with this white privilege, and white people also need to be honest with themselves and explain what they mean by white privilege. And I suspect, as I said earlier, one of the reasons that term has become so popular is because it takes the focus of the problem of white people. But I put it to you tonight, racism, white supremacy is not a problem of non-whites, is a problem of white people. When it comes to racism, white supremacy, white people are the problem. White people need to dismantle this system. But I suspect it's not going to be easily done. It's been around for 500 years, and white people benefit from the system. Dismantling it would mean power sharing, sharing resources, and bringing about a just world, an equitable world, which we don't have right now. The minority group of people on the planet consume and have access to a vast majority of the resources. And I think this is what racism and white supremacy is all about: hoarding power and hoarding resources so that those considered non-white are never in a position to accumulate wealth and therefore power. So I have to get myself together. When I talk about these things, you get quite angry. I've been trying to learn more about this system because before we started, as you saw, the video Maureen played of all the non-white people, and in particular Black people, who've lost their lives because of this system. Not only is it distressing to a Black person to watch this, but it terrorizes your psyche. It's almost like you have to blot it out or have this double consciousness. I think W.E.B. Du Bois once said that Black people have this double consciousness in order to survive this terroristic system. You pretend on the one, well, almost pretend, well, you have it sort of in your back of your mind, you know, that this is not really happening, or, you know, you even get conditioned to believe it's not happening, and, you know, there's just a few bad eggs. But you still have to make a living, get a job, and put up with all the racial harassment, however subtle, because I think this is the problem we have here in Britain, that, well, my white friends that I talk to, oh, it's not that bad here, but in America, you know, with the deaths of unarmed non-whites, especially Blacks, you know, people in this part of the world tend to tell themselves that it's really bad in the US, but not here in the UK. But here in the UK is a very subtle thing, and I actually consider that worse. I rather know the dangers I face so that I can arm myself and prepare, rather than, you know, the opposite, really. But this is going to sound controversial. If you agree that this racism, white supremacy as a system exists, you don't have to agree. I find most white people don't agree. And some non-whites as well, because they're so confused as to how the system works. But if this system exists, and I believe 110% that it does exist, when you consider the history of our relationship with white people, from first contact to now, from what we've gone through, from slavery to, you know, in America, Jim Crow laws, to lynchings, you know, which essentially the killings by the police is effectively modern day lynchings. If you believe this exists, then I'm asking white people then to consider this, especially when you say you're not racist. Under a system of racism, white supremacy, every white person is a suspected racist, because you are conditioned by the system. And if you're committed to dismantling this, I think you need to start having conversations with yourself like that. Not that every time I've tackled the issue with white people, I've been accused of being a racist, or that, no, they're not racist. How can you not be racist under this system? From the day you're born, you're conditioned by the media with the propaganda, by the education system with the conditioning. So as a way forward, white people need to look at themselves and their position under this system, and how they maintain it and how they benefit from it. Because there's no way that any human being can escape this system and not be touched by it unless you're superhuman. And as for non-whites, be aware of the system. I don't think whites tend to want to discuss these issues. I mean, I've just finished reading a book called The Heart of Whiteness, confronting racism and white privilege, this book here. And it's a white professor that discusses this. And I'm always suspicious about white people opening up with some honesty, because under this system, as I said, white people don't tend to be honest, but I went with it. It did drop some interesting points and constructive information, and how white people feel angry, guilty. And I'm gonna add this myself, which he didn't say. I think white people suffer from cognitive dissonance and white fragility. And because of that, tend to shut down discussions about race, or turn it on the non-white person who's attempting to have that discussion. If all these people are here, and I'm sure there must be some white people watching this now, this is what I would, if you take anything away tonight, I would appreciate it as a non-white person. Of course, you're white, you can do what you like. This is the power you have. You have power. You don't have privilege, you have power to do whatever you wish. You have the power not to listen to me. You have the power to accuse me of all sorts of things, and the system will come to your aid and defend you. Despite all that, I ask you to consider this. If you agree we live in a racist system, ask yourself, how am I not a racist? And for non-white people, we are victims of racism, white supremacy. Now, when I say this, I don't mean that we're victims without agency. We have the ability to speak up, to affect change. Once you accept that this system exists and not be swayed by what you're told by the system, you know, that it's just a little problem and all that. It's not a little problem because it affects every single aspect of your life. It affects your health. I suspect what is going on now with the COVID-19 infections, which now we're to learn Black people and Asians, you know, basically non-whites are suffering more with the virus. Why is that? When you listen to the news, it just states, oh, you know, again, something I consider racist, that Asians tend to a household and, you know, nonsense like that. But ask yourself, is it that, or is it because of the system of racism, white supremacy, which does not afford non-whites the same level of care that a white person might get? Personally, I think that's what is at play now. Racism affects our lives, it affects our livelihood. So I implore non-whites and whites, if you want to be an ally, to learn the system. Do not flinch from it. Be suspicious of any white person who tells you that the system does not exist. A white person should be viewed with suspicion under this system because they're conditioned to be racist. And you're conditioned to not only be a victim, but to be a white sympathizer. In fact, that's what I found anyway, that you basically hate yourself, but put on a pedestal, you know, white people, and white people are always right. White people are the authority. But once you accept that you are being conditioned, it is time to question and challenge the system. And do not accept that what I consider is refined racism from whites when they say, I don't know anything about racism. And in fact, I'll give you a little anecdote. When all the protesters were out in the streets, and, you know, it seemed to be all around the world, a white friend called me and said, oh, I just wanted to get your take on this, Vicky, because I don't really know what's going on. It's, you know, it's really difficult to have a conversation because it's somebody who you've considered a friend for like 20 years, you know? And then suddenly I'm supposed to be the expert on a system that was created by whites and maintained by whites. Again, I think that's the way we're confused by everything, that we know more about the system. We don't. Anytime any white person says to you that I don't know much about racism, that's a demonstration of a white person's power, I feel. What really a white person is saying is that I have the power not to think about this, because it doesn't have to be my reality, it's not my reality, and so therefore I won't think about it. I wish we had the same level of power. But anyway, we had this conversation which I found really quite exhausting. Now, this is what it does, you know, the system does to Blacks and other non-whites, as well, it certainly does to me. You know, your mental health can suffer when you have to almost like pick your words carefully when you're talking to a white person, especially a friend. And straight away, if I try to get to the heart of the matter, the defenses come up. So it's kind of like curtails the conversation. And I think this is, again, this is the way racism is practiced. Always go some distance to stop the conversation developing any further than I think white people are responsible for the system that we're living under and have a responsibility to dismantle it. And I think the time, I must admit, I really don't understand what's going on now in the zeitgeist. It feels to me, you know, with all the protests and all that, I wanted to think that this was perhaps change was afoot. I'm not so sure, to be honest with you. As I said, I'm being very honest tonight with my conversation, because racism, white supremacy has been around for 500 years, virtually. Why is it suddenly now people are talking about it? George Floyd lost his life, but he's one of many. You saw the video that Maureen played. There are loads, and there have been loads more since his passing. So what is it that was different about this particular Black man's death to spark these conversations? We've been shouting from the rooftops for years about racism and the system, and the powers that be have never listened. So why are they listening now? That's if they are listening. If I look at it with a cold eye as I'm trying to learn more about the system, it's been around for so long because it manages to adapt and change depending on the era that we're living in. For instance, you know, maybe not in my lifetime, but it was quite acceptable to openly racially abuse non-whites and Blacks. It's acceptable to, you know, put in your window, we don't want Blacks here, etc., etc. But now, you know, and use all types of racial slurs. But now that has changed, you can't do that anymore. So that was a change and refinement of the system in the last 30 years or so. So I suspect what is going on now is possibly another refinement of racism, white supremacy. In order for it to survive, it has to meet with the times. And although I could be wrong, and I hope I am wrong, that this is going to be real change, but as I say, I'm watching it coolly and with an unemotional eye, because my survival depends on it, what is happening with this system. If it is undergoing some sort of refinement, then this is a message to non-whites in the room. Learn this system and why it's changing. Learn our history and relationship with non-whites. You can have white friends and they will still practice racism against you. I've experienced it a few times. But the more you learn about the system, the more you will recognize these instances when it's happening. Because if you caught me 3-4 years ago, I would never have known it. But since I made it now my mission to learn about the system, I'm aware when changes are afoot, and I'm aware when whites are practicing racism, however subtle. Anyway, I hope I haven't talked for too long, but just in recapping, really, I was to talk about white privilege. Perhaps I've veered off a little bit, I don't know. Watching the videos made me a little bit emotional. But I want to do away with this white privilege because I feel it's a form, this is one of the ways that white people practice racism and take the heat off themselves and responsibility for the system. You do not have privilege. You've never worked or earned the place and position you occupy now. It was through the brutality of your ancestors that has placed you in this position. And you are now, I do not say I suspect, and you are now maintaining the system in order to continue to receive those benefits and do it in rather subtle ways and by denying the reality of those who are victimized by the system makes our position even worse. When a non-white tells you that something is, this is a racist encounter, you are not in a position as a white person to say that it's not racist, because that is not your reality under this system. And also, I suspect it's in your interest to deny that a racist incident has occurred, because this is how the system keeps chugging along. So if you insist on using white privilege, I know what you're up to. I understand exactly what the system is doing, and I implore non-whites to also look at this with a suspicious eye every time someone uses white privilege, and question them. What is this white privilege? How did you come by it? It's unearned. What did you do to get this privilege? Or is it really a position of power? Is that what you mean? Because white people have right now the power in the world to affect the outcome of the life of a heck of a lot of people on this globe. So as far as I'm concerned, there's no such thing as white privilege, but white power. And white people's insistence on not using that is a form of racism as well. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Victoria, for making a very clear distinction between white supremacy and white privilege. It's really great to hear you speak. Just want to give you some feedback. We've had a tweet in relation to your talk. And she says, everything that you said has been such complete truth, especially the discussion around refinement. So thank you.